We set boundaries because through them we can actually sustain and present our best selves. But something that nobody ever prepares you for when it comes to setting boundaries is, what do you do? How do you deal with somebody reacting negatively to your boundary? We all know that setting boundaries is extremely vital for our well-being in every aspect of life, not just professionally, but also when it comes to our relationships, personally, really with anybody that we deal with. And we set boundaries because through them we can actually sustain and present our best selves. But something that nobody ever prepares you for when it comes to setting boundaries is, what do you do? How do you deal with somebody reacting negatively to your boundary? Or the conflict that comes from expressing a boundary, and especially when it's somebody that you know really well and you're really close to, them taking it in a really negative way. Maybe you've experienced this before. I know for myself, this was the hardest thing I had to deal with. And a lot of the time, honestly, I started to wonder if it was better if I just stayed quiet and if I just kind of went along with my old ways, which was always to be the one that never said anything, right? That I had learned that if I didn't stand up for myself, I would be liked by other people and we would avoid conflicts, right? But then I realized that it still left me really unhappy and dissatisfied in my life. So having conflict had me dissatisfied. Not having conflict had me dissatisfied. And I realized that conflict is just an unavoidable part of life. And what I had to learn was that actually also the conflict of you having a boundary is something to be expected. So if you've ever set a boundary and let somebody know, because at the end of the day, all boundaries are going to be somehow expressed to an external party. Otherwise, we wouldn't need to set them in the first place. So once we've set them, we almost have to just get this into our heads immediately to expect there to be friction. Expect friction. And I don't mean to go into the situation and be on the lookout for it, but you can come prepared knowing that this person may potentially react to what I'm going to say or how I'm going to reestablish, communication or behaving with me, that they may not really get it immediately. But it's also something that you shouldn't blame them for. Because imagine this, once you've taken the time to think about what you want, who you are, what you value, and so now that may mean that you have to re-establish, for example, in your professional life, your value, the pricing that you were charging. Maybe you realize that, I've actually really been undervaluing myself. So now I need to express that as of the near future, working with me is going to look a little different. Or you may have been practicing certain behaviors that were really detrimental to your health. So in a personal relationship, for example, if your parent is somebody who comes to you always complaining to you about your sibling, right? And you've expressed, I'm not going to take this emotional load anymore. You know that this may not sit well with them. But you need to understand that you took the time to think about what you needed in your life to be your best self. Because our boundaries are there to help others treat us the way that we want to be treated. They're there so that we can actually teach people how to love us and treat us in the best way possible. And vice versa. And that's constantly going to change because we as human beings constantly change, right? And so, coming back to this example with the parent, you don't have to be harsh or brutal or anything, but just understand that it's going to be a shock to the system because you've essentially done more miles, covered more distance per se, being the way that you were, than you have in your new version of you, right? The you with these newer standards. And so let the person have their reaction. Allow them to have that space, just like you had the space to think through and contemplate and really integrate this within yourself. It takes a little bit of time for it to be integrated in the external world around you, right? And trust me when I say this, I know that especially with people you are close to, setting boundaries can be one of the scariest and hardest things ever, because there's always that fear of losing that person. Even though sometimes we know, like, they're gonna love us anyway, but that short amount of time, or however long it is, for that discomfort to be there, it's inevitable. It really sometimes is inevitable. But understand that you have responsibility just for yourself. It's your responsibility to set these standards and to communicate them. And I cannot underline this point enough. Essentially, don't be surprised if somebody reacts negatively to something and you said, but listen, you just overstepped a boundary, but you never communicated that boundary. I know for myself in my professional career, for the longest time, I would go over time when I had my client calls, and I would let it pass and I would let it pass. And then one time I was really annoyed about somebody taking over 25 minutes of my time. And they said, but Lina, all of our sessions have been like that. And you know, I really had to reflect on it. And I thought, you know what, you're right. And so the next time we connected, I just had to establish some boundaries. And these circumstances can actually be a really, really useful tool when we feel that our boundaries have been pushed to their limits or overstepped or misunderstood. We get to take some time to contemplate. So this is a useful tool that you can use as well. What I do is I always come back to my reflections. I always come back to journaling and preparing what I'm going to say. And also preparing in a way where I'm not thinking of it word for word, but I've taken the time in neutrality to think through not only what do I need, but why do I need it? And why is it important for me to express this to the person I'm going to express it to? Now, there may be circumstances as well where someone is just not going to understand your boundaries, or it may mean losing a relationship. And I want to share something with you that may be useful. When I had to essentially take a really big inventory, a stock of how I was conducting myself professionally, I realized just how greatly I had been really betraying myself. I was undercharging, undervaluing, overworking, making myself available literally all day and neglecting my own self-care. And what that meant was I was also attracting clients who profited from that. They benefited from me not having any boundaries in place. And so I set up a contract. I set up non-disclosure agreements for my work because people started copying my work and I had nothing in place to protect myself. I started to really express in emails and to my clients when it wasn't okay, for example, that, they would email me all the time and ask me certain questions, and really, I wanted them to understand that I valued their time and I needed my time to be valued. Now, there were a number of other things, but what I really want to say with that is, with one of these clients, it actually meant that I had to terminate our engagement. I had to turn down the opportunity for income because the people that were interested in my services no longer actually aligned with the new standards I had set for myself. And that felt scary because I really had to dig deep and know why I set these new standards, because I had realized what I was doing and the power it had, the transformation it was creating in other people's lives. And so this is something to also be mindful of, that when you express these boundaries and you're met with resistance, it's like Lisa Nichols says, a gift wrapped in sandpaper. At the time it feels rough, it does not feel comfortable, and it can be a little bit frightening, especially let's say if you're counting on this income from that person. But what I've learned at least is to have a little bit of faith, a lot of faith actually. Trust yourself. These standards, these boundaries, they came from you, so they came there, they've been set in place for a reason. Don't back down on that. Understand that not everyone is going to understand you. Not everyone is going to be okay with these standards. But when you allow for that space, you allow the people to have their reaction, and you remain centered within yourself, then the great things that you're desiring will come. I promise you, they will come. But we must stay firm within ourselves and know that we shouldn't blame anybody for their reaction, but we can take ownership and responsibility for how we communicate our standards, and most importantly, why we set them. So I hope you found this video helpful. Let me know in the comments below, have you ever had an experience like this? One similar to being met with this resistance from setting boundaries. If you enjoyed this content, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and I'll see you next time.